Buenas tardes. Tengan todas y todos ustedes. Declaro abierta la sesión número 1899 del Consejo de Seguridad. El orden del día provisional para esta reunión es el siguiente: paz y seguridad en África. Queda aprobado el orden del día. De conformidad con el artículo 37 del Reglamento Provisional del Consejo, invito a la representación de Etiopía a participar en esta sesión. Así queda acordado. De conformidad con el artículo 39 del Reglamento Provisional del Consejo, invito a los siguientes ponentes a participar en esta sesión: la señora Rosemary DiCarlo, secretaria general adjunta de Asuntos Políticos y de Consolidación de la Paz; el excelentísimo señor Olusegun Obasanjo, alto representante de la Presidencia de la Comisión de la Unión Africana para la región del Cuerno de África. Así queda acordado. El Consejo de Seguridad iniciará ahora el examen del punto 2 del orden del día. Doy la palabra a la señora Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, thank you for this opportunity to brief the Security Council on the situation in Ethiopia. And I welcome today the participation of President Obasanjo, African Union High Representative for the Horn of Africa. Mr. President, the year-long conflict in the Tigray region of Ethiopia has reached disastrous proportions. The fighting places the future of the country and its people, as well as the stability of the wider Horn of Africa region, in grave uncertainty. In recent days, Tigrayan forces have advanced southwards toward Addis Ababa, acting in coordination with the Oromo Liberation Army. The government of Ethiopia has declared a nationwide state of emergency and has stated it is fighting an existential war. Elsewhere, insecurity in the Oromia region continues to worsen, while the situation in parts of the Benishangul Gumuz region remains tense. There has been much speculation regarding how this crisis will unfold over the coming weeks. In a country of over 110 million people, over 90 different ethnic groups, and 80 languages, no one can predict what continued fighting and insecurity will bring. But let me be clear. What is certain is that the risk of Ethiopia descending into a widening civil war is only too real. That would bring about a humanitarian catastrophe and consume the future of such an important country. The political repercussions of intensifying violence in the wider region would be immense, compounding the many crises besetting the Horn of Africa. Just in northern Ethiopia today, more than 7 million people need humanitarian assistance. Efforts to mobilize assistance in Tigray, where more than 5 million people need food, and an estimated 400,000 people are living in famine-like conditions, continue to be undermined by an inability to move cash, fuel, and supplies into the region. No airstrikes have reached Mekelle since 18 October amid continued airstrikes. United Nations humanitarian air service flights have remained suspended since airstrikes on 22 October forced a flight to return to Addis Ababa. We've been unable to move fuel into Tigray since August. While some emergency supplies have been moved, it has been 4 months since the last major shipment of medicines and health supplies into Tigray. Lack of access means that humanitarian organizations have had to scale back core life-saving activities, including water trucking, food distributions, mobile clinics, and support for acutely malnourished children and mothers. Needs and protection concerns are also rapidly escalating in the Amhara and Afar regions, with large numbers of people fleeing from their homes as the fighting continues to expand. Let us recall that this expanding crisis is happening in a country that was already grappling with enormous humanitarian challenges, including local conflicts, flooding, drought, and infectious disease outbreaks. While needs are most acute in the north, across Ethiopia as a whole, more than 20 million people are estimated to need some form of humanitarian support, and more than 5 million people are internally displaced. Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths traveled to Ethiopia over the weekend to review Ethiopia's increasing needs and plan for a greater humanitarian response should the fighting continue, as is feared. Unfettered access to conflict areas remains key. Mr. President, last week, the report of the joint OHCHR Ethiopian Human Rights Commission investigation into the conflict in Tigray, which covered the period between November 2020 and June 2021, shed light on the horrific suffering civilians have endured. The report includes that there are reasonable grounds to believe that all parties to the conflict, including the Ethiopian National Defense Force, Eritrean Defense Force, Amhara Special Forces, and allied militia on one side, and Tigrayan forces on the other, committed violations of international human rights, humanitarian, and refugee law, to include attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, indiscriminate attacks resulting in civilian casualties, and extrajudicial killings, torture, arbitrary detentions, sexual and gender-based violence, and forced displacement. The report states that war crimes and crimes against humanity may have been committed. It also outlines steps that should be taken to ensure accountability for these acts. High Commissioner Bachelet highlighted in her remarks last week that incidents of serious human rights violations have continued. More recently, incidents of hate speech and targeting of ethnic groups have increased at an alarming rate. In this regard, the Security Council's call on 5 November for refraining from inflammatory speech and incitement to violence is welcome and timely. Mr. President, there must be an immediate cessation of hostilities. This has been the call of the Secretary General, African Union Commission Chair Faki, IGAD Executive Secretary Workna, the leader of Ethiopia's key neighbor, Kenya President Uhuru Kenyatta, and the UN Security Council. They've also called for negotiation of a lasting ceasefire and for the creation of conditions for an inclusive Ethiopian dialogue to resolve the crisis and create the foundation for peace and stability throughout the country. The Secretary General has been in frequent contact with Prime Minister Abiy, urging restraint and dialogue and offering his good offices. Further, the Secretary General has offered President Obasanjo the full support of the United Nations to his efforts to resolve the conflict. UN colleagues on the ground continue to urge all sides to this conflict to show restraint and provide unfettered access to vulnerable populations. Mr. President, the recently concluded elections in Ethiopia demonstrated the people's commitment to the democratic process. At the ceremony to mark his new mandate last month, Prime Minister Abiy spoke of his government's commitment to resolve the ongoing challenges and his intention to launch a national dialogue. The urgency for such an inclusive initiative has never been greater. In closing, let me stress that the UN is steadfastly committed to stay and deliver in Ethiopia in support of all the people of the country. We continue our work there, including thanks to the dedication of our Ethiopian national staff, who must be provided full protection by national authorities, regardless of their background. Ethiopia, a founding member of the United Nations, needs our support. We urge Ethiopians to come together to build a shared, prosperous future before it is too late. Thank you, Mr. President.
Doy las gracias a la señora Di Carlo por la información que nos ha proporcionado y doy ahora la palabra al excelentísimo señor Olusegun Obasanjo.
And Raymond Lafuente, President of the UN Security Council. Your Excellency, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, members of the Council, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure and honor for me to be invited to the briefing of this august body to discuss the situation in Ethiopia within the context of its agenda item, peace and security in Africa. I wish to express my heartfelt thanks and appreciation to the President and members of the Council for this invitation, which will allow me to exchange views on pertinent unfolding developments in one of the strategic countries of the continent of Africa. I also wish to thank the chairperson of the AU Commission for my nomination on the 26th of August, 2021 as the African Union High Representative for the Horn of Africa, to intensify engagements with all relevant political actors and stakeholders towards promoting and entrenching durable peace and stability within the Horn of Africa, as well as support to AU-led strategies and diplomatic interventions in the region through the facilitation of inclusive political dialogue, reconciliation, and social cohesion processes. The appointment is a delicate one for two principal reasons. It is the first ever appointment by the AU of a high representative for an entire region. And the second reason is that each of the 8 countries of the region has a specific context. My assignment is part of the AU drive to promote peace, security, stability, and political dialogue all over the Horn of Africa region, and has allowed me to engage with most of the leaders of the region, relevant bilateral and multilateral partners, as well as key political actors and stakeholders, especially in Ethiopia. Apart from the region, I have also paid visits to Europe to meet with the President of the Republic of France and to Brussels to meet with the leaders of the European Union from 5th of October to 8th of October 2021. I have also traveled to the United States of America, where I met with the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Secretary of State of the United States of America from 9th to 14th October 2021. These initial visits offered me the opportunity to discuss with world leaders about the objective of the appointment, as well as to solicit their logistical and all other supports towards the implementation of my mandate. Since I began the assignment, I have briefed the AU Peace and Security Council on 2 occasions, the first of which was on the 28th of October 2021 on the region, and the second only this morning, specifically on the situation in Ethiopia. The Undersecretary has given us a little bit of the situation, the present situation in Ethiopia. Mr. President, it is pertinent to point out that the crisis situation in northern Ethiopia has continued to drastically deteriorate in recent weeks, leading to a serious escalation of the situation. I've been following these developments with keen attention, and it is owing to the rapid changes in trend that I am paying another visit here in Ethiopia to engage all stakeholders for the de-escalation of the situation. It should be noted that following days of report of intense fighting in the north of the country, the Ethiopian cabinet declared on the 2nd of November a nationwide state of emergency with immediate effect, while the central authority urging the citizens to prepare to defend the capital. The mass demonstration yesterday, 7th November, as well as other similar demonstrations in several cities in support of the federal government, is evident of the present reality. Distinguished members of the Council, since my arrival in Ethiopia on the 4th of November, after my visit to Sudan on a day earlier, I have met with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, the President of Ethiopia, the President of Oromia, and had meaningful discussion with them on the ongoing escalation, with reflection on how to de-escalate tension and to pave the way for dialogue. During my meetings with the Prime Minister, we agreed that I pay a visit to Mekelle to meet the Tigrain leaders. It is in this context that I traveled to Mekelle yesterday, 7th November, to engage the leaders of the northern region in an effort to de-escalate tension and to begin to find an amicable solution to the situation. As a summary to our discussions, all these leaders here in Addis Ababa and in the north agree individually that the difference between them are political and require political solution through dialogue. This, therefore, constitutes a window of opportunity that we can collectively tap into to assist the people of Ethiopia to find lasting solution to the ongoing crisis. It is, however, important to mention the window of opportunity we have is very little and that the time is short for any intervention in this regard. The ongoing conflict situation continues to have severe humanitarian consequences on the population, with huge impact on socioeconomic development and stability. The time is now for collective actions in finding lasting solutions to avoid further escalation of the situation, which may have direct effect on the strategic Horn of Africa region as a whole. Your Excellency, the President of the Council, please permit me, following the foregoing, to urge the Council to consider the following. One, strongly urge and encourage the federal government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People Liberation Front to engage in political dialogue without any preconditions. Two, call for an immediate and unconditional comprehensive ceasefire and cessation of hostilities by all parties. Three, call for immediate and unhindered humanitarian access. Four, call on the parties to ensure respect and compliance with international humanitarian and human rights laws and practice. Five, call for an immediate commencement of an all-inclusive national dialogue and reconciliation. And six, call on international community to rally behind the AU-led process in order to ensure coherence and unity of purpose for our peacemaking efforts in the Horn of Africa and particularly in Ethiopia. In the last 48 hours, Mr. President, as I said, I have visited Mekelle, capital of Tigray. I have consulted with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, the President of Tigray, the President of Oromia region, and the President of the Republic of Ethiopia. I've also consulted with the chairperson of AU Commission. Tomorrow, I will be paying a visit to Amhara region and Afar region, all in effort to harmonize the views of the leaders in the area of withdrawal of troops from regions that are not theirs, and also in maintaining humanitarian access. All these, I believe, are very important, and they are the areas of priority that most of the leaders that I have consulted with have indicated. And I hope that with the efforts we have in hand, before the end of this week, we hope to have a program in hand that will indicate how we can get the humanitarian and withdrawal of troops all put together to meet the immediate demand of the stakeholders. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for listening to me.
Doy las gracias al excelentísimo señor Obasanjo por la información que nos ha proporcionado. Daré ahora la palabra a los miembros del Consejo que desean formular declaraciones. Tiene la palabra la representante de Irlanda.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I want to start by thanking Under Secretary General De Carlo and in particular you, High Representative Obasanjo, for your really important briefings. In the context of what we've just heard and the excellent work that the High Representative is already doing, despite the uncertainties we heard from Under Secretary General De Carlo, we want to believe that we may just be beginning to see possible pathways emerge for an end to this crisis. We certainly share the view that we dare not miss the window of opportunity for peace. That's why when I consider this conflict, my abiding feelings are of shame and frustration. Shame because as a council, we around this table have stood by as this crisis has intensified over the past year, causing immeasurable suffering for millions of Ethiopians. Frustration because the Council's voice matters on this issue and it has the power to deliver change. We remained silent for too long. But today I want to commend our African colleagues with whom we worked to gain agreement at last on a Council statement last Friday, a Council statement that calls squarely for an immediate ceasefire. That African leadership in New York is also manifest at African Union headquarters, where we saw the African Union PSC meet just today, and importantly also on the ground where it matters most to the people of Ethiopia. We depend on regional leaders, in particular on you, High Representative Obasanjo. We rely on regional organisations, including IGAD, which have a crucial role to play in engaging with all sides, supporting mediation efforts, and ultimately assisting Ethiopia to find a solution to this crisis. We welcome the efforts that are taking place as we speak. We call on everyone in Ethiopia to embrace this opportunity. Time is of the essence. Your people are putting their faith in you. For the good of your country, the fighting needs to stop, the talking needs to start. We are 1 year on from the beginning of this crisis. Today we must ask ourselves if we as this Council have done enough to prevent catastrophe, a catastrophe that is causing untold harm to the people of Ethiopia. As each month passes, we have seen the situation deteriorate. For the ordinary people of Ethiopia, their futures are being stripped away. As we heard last week from the OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, there have been shocking human rights abuses committed during this conflict. Women, men, and children have been raped in horrific fashion, and let me be clear, civilians have borne the brunt of the violence. International humanitarian law and human rights norms have been cast aside. Meanwhile, vital, life-saving aid has been blocked from reaching starving and sick people. In recent days, the situation has become even more grave. Humanitarian operations across northern Ethiopia have effectively ground to a halt. Military operations have escalated. A state of emergency has been declared, suspending the basic rights of Ethiopian citizens. More people have been displaced. Lives and livelihoods have been lost. We've also witnessed increasingly shocking incidences of hate speech and dehumanizing language that risk inciting the worst type of violence against individuals or groups within Ethiopian society. We simply cannot stand by and allow this to continue. Too many lives are at stake. Meanwhile, continued military actions and mobilization now threaten the very stability and territorial integrity which are vital for Ethiopia and for the region. Today our messages are to all parties. Today, our messages are clear and simple. First, it's paramount that all parties must immediately facilitate the provision of life-saving humanitarian aid to those who desperately need it in line with international humanitarian law. Second, we need an immediate end to the fighting. Civilians must be protected. Third, we need all parties to the conflict to embrace negotiations towards a lasting political solution. Fourth, that chilling hate speech, dehumanizing language, and incitement to violence must end. Accountability is imperative. Fifth, we need an inclusive and Ethiopian-led national dialogue that includes all regions and stakeholders. We cannot wait any longer to act on these 5 important steps. Mr. President, Ethiopia has been an inspiring example of peace and stability in Africa. Ireland's relationship with Ethiopia is one of our oldest and closest on the African continent. We remain deeply committed to supporting Ethiopia and its people. It is also shocking and tragic that the entire country now risks being overrun by violence and conflict. This unnecessary war must end now. All sides in Ethiopia must turn the tide towards peace and now steer the country back to where the people of Ethiopia deserve to be, on a hopeful pathway to peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
Doy las gracias a la representante de Irlanda por su declaración y tiene la palabra el representante de Túnez.
Thank you, Mr. President. I take the floor on behalf of the A3+1, namely Kenya, Niger, Tunisia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, on the developing situation in Ethiopia. I wish to express our sincere condolences to the government and people of Niger for the heinous terrorist attack that took place recently in the country. I thank His Excellency President Obasanjo, the African Union High Representative for the Horn of Africa, and Under-Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, for their insightful presentations. We thank President Obasanjo for his extensive efforts within the African Union-led process, and we welcome in this regard the communique of the African Union Peace and Security Council issued today on the situation in Ethiopia. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ethiopia. Mr. President, 1 month after our last meeting, the situation in Ethiopia continues to deteriorate dangerously, especially during the last 2 weeks, bringing this sister nation every day closer to a full-scale civil war, which, if not stopped immediately, could result to unprecedented violence and widespread atrocities and threaten the unity and territorial integrity of Ethiopia, with the potential to occasion destabilizing effects in the wider region. The A3+1 is deeply concerned over the escalation of military confrontation in northern Ethiopia and its expansion to the Amhara and Afar regions, as well as about its impacts on the humanitarian front. Once more, we highlight that the priority at this stage is to achieve an immediate ceasefire, which is crucial to allow for an unrestricted humanitarian access to the affected communities, as well as for the re-establishment of public services in all the conflict areas. We therefore call for the immediate cessation of hostilities, the full respect for the life and property of civilians, as well as state infrastructure, and urge the parties to the conflict to constructively engage in discussions to seek a peaceful solution and pave the way for an inclusive Ethiopian-led dialogue and to national reconciliation in the interests of the country. At the same time, we remind all parties that they should respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law, with particular regard to the protection of civilians, which requires all parties to urge their supporters to abstain from acts of reprisal against any community and refrain from hate speech and incitement to violence and divisiveness, as stated by the chairperson of the African Union Commission on November the 3rd. All Ethiopians are one people. As A3+1, we urge all Ethiopians to embrace one another and to refuse to be pitted against one another on account of ethnic, religious, or other identities. Mr. President, today, peace and security in the Horn of Africa is at risk. The lives of millions of men and women and children are at stake, and we have a huge and historic responsibility to prevent large-scale atrocities and famine, and to forestall possible destabilization of the region. Today, we have a strong need for diplomacy and for mediation. We welcome the initiatives of the United Nations Secretary General and all international partners and regional leaders to find a peaceful solution to this crisis. We believe that it is important today that we speak with one voice and send a clear and united message to all parties in Ethiopia that violence is not an option to resolving the political disputes, however serious they may be. We have witnessed during the last year how violence led to loss of thousands of lives and millions of displaced persons, human rights violations and atrocities, and to a dire humanitarian situation. We are left with the question, how much longer and how many more innocent Ethiopians must perish before all parties can understand that there can be no military solution to this crisis? Ethiopia, this great nation and cradle of civilization, which has been an anchor of regional peace and stability, deserves that we stand with its people in these trying times. In this regard, we believe that the African Union and the neighboring countries have a major role to play to help Ethiopians find their way to peace and stability through political dialogue and reconciliation. We should help them unite again under the common interest of their country. We reiterate our full support to the African Union High Representative for the Horn of Africa, His Excellency President Obasanjo, and commend his mediation efforts to achieve a ceasefire and a prompt and peaceful resolution of the conflict. We call on all stakeholders and international partners to extend every possible support to President Obasanjo in his highly important mission, cognizant of the importance of coordinated action. In conclusion, Mr. President, we, the A3+1, reaffirm our respect for and commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. We stand on solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Ethiopia through these trying times in their pursuit for peace and stability. I thank you.
Agradezco a la representante de Túnez por su declaración y doy la palabra a la representante de Noruega.
Thank you, President. And thank you to A3+1 and Ireland for leading the call to add this item to our agenda. This is indeed a time when a strong and united message from the Council is critical. And thank you to USG DiCarlo and the AU High Representative for the Horn of Africa for their briefing, and not least the efforts by the AU. The development of the crisis in Ethiopia is threatening the stability and the very integrity of the country. It's hitting the civilian population hard, and certainly the most vulnerable the hardest. As a close friend and decade-long partner to Ethiopia and the Ethiopian people, Norway is deeply concerned, both by the magnitude of the crisis and its potential regional impact. There can be no military solution. This should be evident to all parties, from the federal government to the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front and the Oromo Liberation Army. Further escalation of fighting will not lead to victory. It will only inflict more unnecessary suffering on the Ethiopian people. We are deeply concerned by reports of increased ethnic profiling and discrimination. Ethnically charged statements inciting violence will only deepen divisions, perhaps to irreversible levels. Divisive actions today make peace more difficult tomorrow. We urge Ethiopian leaders to already recognize the need for a future inclusive dialogue and reconciliation process. President, all parties must exercise maximum restraint and immediately work to de-escalate the conflict. We specifically call on the TDF, the TPLF, and forces from the Oromo Liberation Army not to attempt an attack on Addis Ababa. We also urge the government of Ethiopia to refrain from imposing any measures or restrictions upon civilians of specific ethnicities, including Tigray and Oromo. Norway fully supports the AUP's initiative and the mandate and efforts of the AU High Representative for the Horn of Africa. We call on all parties to fully cooperate with the High Representative, to immediately stop fighting and make the necessary concessions for a negotiated cessation of hostilities. President, the humanitarian situation is extremely dire. Hundreds of thousands in Tigray are facing famine-like conditions, and there is a serious risk of large-scale famine. At least 2 million persons are displaced in Tigray and hundreds and thousands in Amara and Afar. Access to food, health care, and other basic services must be restored, and all possible modalities for this must be explored. We call on all parties to immediately facilitate full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. We know that the suffering of the Ethiopian people also go beyond the current humanitarian crisis. Norway is appalled by the findings in the joint report by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. While limited in time and geographical scope, it outlines a pattern of the killing of civilians and the widespread and systematic use of sexual and gender-based violence. The obligation of all are made clear. Incidents must be investigated and perpetrators brought to justice. All parties to the conflicts must fully respect international human rights and international humanitarian law, even in the most dire circumstances. President, every day that the fighting continues and that the rhetoric grows only makes a credible accountability process and a viable transitional justice mechanism more vital. These mechanisms will be of utmost importance to future national reconciliation. The people of Ethiopia, indeed all people in the broader region, are dependent on the ability of the parties to urgently find a path to sustainable peace, and we stand ready to assist. Thank you.
Agradezco a la representante de Noruega por su declaración y doy la palabra al representante de Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would like to thank USG DiCarlo and the High Representative, the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Obasanjo, for their insightful briefings. I welcome the ambassadors, permanent representative of Ethiopia, to our meeting today. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned about the deteriorating situation in Ethiopia, especially the continued fighting and expansions of combat and hostility in and around Tigray, Amhara and Afar regions over the weekend. The sharp escalation of military operation and clashes in the last few weeks have plunged Ethiopia and the region into a more serious level of instabilities, pushing the party to a point of no return. These developments have also brought about consequences and adverse impact on the daily lives of millions of people while hindering humanitarian activities. We therefore urge all parties to end hostility immediately and start an inclusive Ethiopian national dialogue toward an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and make it sustainable one. Only with sustainable ceasefire can the primary condition can the primary condition for a credible and inclusive dialogue be established to find a political settlement to the long-lasting political grievances that have led to the conflict. Mr. President, the escalating hostility threatened to worsen the already dire humanitarian situation in Tigray, Amhara, and Afar, where millions of people are in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. As reported, 5.2 million people, especially those 400,000 people who live in famine-like conditions, are having to rely on food aid every day. We welcome progress in the practical activities carried out by the United Nations, humanitarian organizations, and international and regional partners to help Ethiopian, including people in Tigray, over the past few months. We also welcome the visit made by the USG Martin Griffiths and the African Union envoy to the Horn of Africa, Obasanjo, to the northern Tigray region of Ethiopia on Sunday to discuss humanitarian access and a possible ceasefire. However, we understand that the access to and distribution of humanitarian assistance remains far from satisfying the urgent needs of people in this region. We therefore call for an immediate removal of restriction and creation of a favorable condition to humanitarian access, full observation of international humanitarian law, and rapid restoration of public services and upscaling humanitarian assistance. All measures must be taken to protect civilians and humanitarian workers. Mr. President, as we stated previously, the crisis in Tigray stems from the complicated political, historical, and ethnic regions. Therefore, rather than invoking further hatreds, relevant parties must give the highest priority to the interest of their people, and therefore patiently engage in dialogue and reconciliation. It is high time for a compromise to be made toward a comprehensive solution for sustained stability and development of Ethiopia on the basis of respecting principles of international laws and the UN Charter. Without a constructive dialogue in place, further bloodshed and confrontational rhetoric will drive parties further apart and block the path of peace. Dialogue should be started right now. Otherwise, it would be too late to save Ethiopia from a catastrophe. In this process, the international community should support all efforts toward the end, including through a swift and effective action, while being full respect of independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. Mr. President, the conflict and situation in Tigray have had certain impact on the region, and thus requires all parties to exercise self-restraint. The principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of the state and settlement dispute by peaceful means should be constantly upheld. In this connection, we support the role of the High Representative of the African Union for the Horn of African regions and his effort to help bring about a ceasefire and a prompt and peaceful resolution to the conflict. We also support the constructive engagement of neighboring countries and regional organizations, especially the African Union, for the sake of peace, stability, security, and national reconciliation, national unity, and development in Ethiopia. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante de Vietnam por su declaración y doy la palabra al representante de China.
谢谢主席先生。主席先生，我感谢迪卡洛副秘书长和非盟非洲之角高级代表奥巴桑乔先生的通报，欢迎埃塞常驻代表阿姆德大使出席今天的会议。最近一段时间，埃塞局势呈现恶化趋势，战火升级蔓延，平民伤亡不断增加，人道局势更趋严峻。非盟和地区国家领导人均对此表达担忧。作为埃塞人民的好朋友，中方衷心希望有关各方能以国家和人民利益为重，保持冷静克制，避免局势进一步升级，同时致力于通过政治对话化解 矛盾分歧，为实现和平和解创造条件。安理会上周五就埃塞局势发表了主席新闻谈话，呼吁停止敌对行动，启动政治对话，希望有关各方予以积极响应。埃塞当前局势是政治、历史、民族等多重因素综合作用的结果，只能从内部寻求解决方案。地区国家和国际组织最了解埃塞历史经纬和现实挑战，可以为政治解决埃塞问题发挥主导作用。中方一贯支持通过非洲方式解决非洲问题，欢迎奥巴桑乔高级代表积极开展政治斡旋，呼吁有关各方和地区国家全力支持高级代表的工作。我们同样欢迎古特雷斯秘书长向埃塞表达斡旋的意愿，期待联合国同非盟加强协调，共同为推动埃塞实现全国范围的和平和解发挥建设性作用。国际社会，尤其是安理会，应为非盟等开展斡旋提供必要的时间和空间，以限制贸易或切断援助为手段向埃塞极限施压，只会对政治解决形成干扰，对各方化解矛盾、重建互信没有帮助。埃塞现在面临着巨大的人道主义需求，国际社会要帮助埃塞提高人道响应能力，扩大救援规模，使人道援助尽可能覆盖到每一个有需要的人。向埃塞提供人道支持，要尊重埃塞的主权和主导权，遵循联合国人道救援指导原则，避免将人道问题政治化。埃塞有关各方均应履行国际人道法义务，保护包括外国公民在内的平民安全，为人道救援提供便利，防止人道局势进一步恶化。埃塞是一个有着悠久历史和灿烂文明的国家，在每一个历史关头，埃塞人民都能团结一心，共同捍卫国家主权统一，共同维护国家长远发展。我们相信，埃塞人民有能力、有智慧克服当前的挑战，保持民族团结，推动国家重回和平稳定和发展振兴的正确轨道。中方愿同国际社会一道，继续支持埃塞人民的努力。谢谢主席先生。
Agradezco al representante de China por su declaración y doy ahora la palabra al representante del Reino Unido.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank High Representative Obasanjo and Under-Secretary General Di Carlo for their important briefings. I also thank the A3+1 and Ireland for calling today's meeting and for their work on Friday's statement for this Council. The United Kingdom shares the serious concerns already expressed today about the situation in Ethiopia, including from the African Union Peace and Security Council. The introduction of a state of emergency by the government of Ethiopia must not be used as an excuse to ignore human rights and international humanitarian law. Violations and abuses of human rights, international humanitarian law, and refugee law are already taking place as a result of this conflict. The report released last week by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission documented these in detail including the widespread use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, torture, attacks on civilians, and forced displacement. All parties should act to implement the recommendations contained in that joint report, ensure accountability, and prevent further suffering. Indeed, addressing the humanitarian and human impact of this tragic conflict should be our immediate focus. And when it is over, we must come together and help Ethiopia heal. Therefore, it's vital that all parties stop fighting and start talking. Tigrayan forces need to stop their advances and return to Tigray. The humanitarian blockade needs to be lifted. Hate speech and ethnic profiling must end. It serves only to set Ethiopian against Ethiopian and deepens divisions which will make recovery from this crisis even harder. The United Kingdom gives its full support to the Secretary-General and His Excellency African Union Special Envoy Obasanjo and urges all parties to make use of their good offices. We stand ready to provide any support that is required. Mr. President, in the last year, this conflict has brought only destruction, suffering, and despair. It is past time for all parties to put the Ethiopian people first. Thank you.
Agradezco al representante del Reino Unido por su declaración y doy ahora la palabra al representante de Francia.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie le Président Obasanjo et Madame Di Carlo pour leurs interventions. J'insisterai sur 3 points. Des décisions immédiates sont d'abord nécessaires pour obtenir un cessez-le-feu et favoriser l'amorce d'un dialogue politique. La France appelle le gouvernement fédéral, le gouvernement régional du Tigré et ses alliés à donner sans délai des gages de leur ouverture au dialogue. Les partis doivent cesser immédiatement les hostilités, figer les positions de leurs forces, s'abstenir d'internationaliser le conflit et s'accorder sur un retrait progressif aux positions d'avant le conflit. La France appelle les autorités éthiopiennes à retirer la désignation du TPLF comme organisation terroriste afin d'ouvrir en urgence des négociations. Le gouvernement régional du Tigré doit reconnaître que l'avenir de la région tigréenne ne pourra être déterminé que dans le cadre d'un dialogue national inclusif et des dispositions prévues par la Constitution, y compris sur le différend frontalier avec la région Amhara. L'ensemble des partis doivent soutenir les efforts de l'Union africaine, du président Obasanjo et du Kenya. Chacun a exprimé sa profonde préoccupation pour la stabilité et l'unité de l'Éthiopie et de la région, mais aussi l'espoir qu'un dialogue puisse enfin faire taire les armes. La France soutient cette démarche, comme le secrétaire général des Nations Unies, ainsi que les principaux partenaires de l'Éthiopie, dont l'Union européenne. Ce Conseil s'est également exprimé de manière unanime pour soutenir leurs efforts. Ces déclarations ont rappelé l'attachement de la communauté internationale à l'unité et à l'intégrité territoriale de l'Éthiopie. Les acteurs de la région qui exploiteraient les vulnérabilités que le conflit a exacerbées en seraient tenus responsables. La France réitère son appel à un retrait définitif et vérifié des forces érythréennes. La communauté internationale est donc unie et mobilisée pour appuyer des efforts de paix et apporter des garanties internationales pour surmonter la défiance. Nous encourageons les parties à saisir cette opportunité. Il est plus nécessaire que jamais que l'ensemble des parties respectent le droit international humanitaire et les droits de l'homme. La protection des civils doit rester la priorité. L'engagement de combat en zone urbaine accroît le risque pour les populations. La France est préoccupée par les violences, les déplacements forcés et les discours de haine qui ciblent l'origine ethnique des victimes. Elle appelle toutes les parties à mettre un terme à ces violences, à lutter contre l'impunité de leurs auteurs et à faire preuve de responsabilité. La France prend note de la publication du rapport de l'enquête conjointe du Haut-Commissariat aux droits de l'homme et de la Commission éthiopienne des droits de l'homme. Elle attend de l'ensemble des parties qu'elle engage des enquêtes crédibles sur les faits allégués. Ceux-ci sont d'une extrême gravité. en particulier les exécutions extrajudiciaires et les nombreux cas de violences sexuelles. Les parties doivent assurer un plein accès pour tout le personnel humanitaire, médical des Nations Unies. Le blocage de l'aide médicale est inacceptable. Nous espérons que ces obstacles seront levés rapidement. La France demande enfin aux parties de garantir l'accès aux prisonniers et d'engager des discussions en vue de leur libération. Je vous remercie.
Agradezco al representante de Francia por su declaración y doy ahora la palabra al representante de la India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me join others in thanking High Representative of the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, His Excellency Obasanjo, and Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, for updating this Council on the recent developments in the northern parts of Ethiopia. I also welcome the presence of Permanent Representative of Ethiopia, Ambassador Thai Selassie, in today's briefing. The conflict in northern parts of Ethiopia has seen escalation in the recent weeks and is threatening to expand towards the central parts of Ethiopia. The fighting has intensified and humanitarian situation has worsened, adversely affecting millions, particularly women, children, and elderly. It is concerning to note that the humanitarian efforts led by the UN has been stalled in the recent weeks. It is important that humanitarian assistance is resumed at the earliest available opportunity. We also reiterate the importance of founding principles of humanitarian assistance, that is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. We have noted the report of the Joint Investigation Team of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the OHCHR. We also note and welcome the recognition and acceptance of the report by the Ethiopian government as an important document that could complement ongoing efforts by the Ethiopian government to address the allegations of human rights violations and abuses. We further note that the report could not confirm deliberate or willful denial of humanitarian assistance to the civilian population in Tigray or the use of starvation as a weapon of war. The Ethiopian government has announced state of emergency in response to persisting conflict and expansion of violence beyond the Tigray region. The inclusive national dialogue announced on October 4th has not moved forward. Military offensive may not help in the resolution of the crisis, and inevitably there has to be a dialogue. India has consistently underscored the importance of mutual trust, engagement, dialogue, and reconciliation to address all issues related to the ongoing conflict. We therefore call upon all stakeholders to seize the opportunity provided by the mediation efforts of the African Union High Representative for the Horn of Africa region, His Excellency Obasanjo, purposefully. We welcome his meeting with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia and take note of his visit to Mekelle. He has also briefed AUPSC today morning. We also welcome the engagement of countries from the region in this process. We urge all sides to exercise restraint and work together to build trust and confidence that could pave way for dialogue. The political and economic stability of Ethiopia is paramount, not just to the Horn of Africa, but the entire African continent. It is in the interest of the region that the current politico-military situation is resolved within the constitutional framework of Ethiopia. In this regard, we support the initiatives of the African Union. It is important that regional initiatives led by the African Union are encouraged and actively supported by this Council. To conclude, India reiterates its strong commitment to the unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante de la India por su declaración y doy ahora la palabra al representante de Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Undersecretary General DiCarlo and High Representative Obasanjo for their briefings. Estonia is deeply concerned about the recent escalation in northern Ethiopia. These developments continue to cause civilian casualties and prolong human suffering and risk the stability of the country and the whole region. We call upon the TPLF to withdraw its troops from Amhara and Afar and the government of Ethiopia to refrain from airstrikes on civilian targets. all parties must do their utmost to protect civilians, including humanitarian and medical workers, in line with their obligations under international humanitarian law. There is no military solution to this conflict. We call upon all parties to immediately end hostilities without preconditions, engage in negotiations for a lasting ceasefire, and to create conditions for the start of a political dialogue. In this context, we would also like to express our full support to the international and regional efforts in achieving a peaceful resolution to the conflict. We encourage the continued engagement of the African Union and support the mediation efforts by the Special Representative Obasanjo. Mr. President, the deteriorating humanitarian crisis in Tigray, Amhara, and Afar regions is deeply worrying, as more and more people are in need of urgent assistance. All parties to the conflict have an obligation to facilitate safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all areas affected by conflict. It is also essential to restore basic services and the entry of fuel, cash, and humanitarian supplies needed for aid operations. We reiterate our deep concern about reported human rights violations and abuses, including widespread sexual and gender-based violence. We welcome the publication of the joint report by the OHCHR and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. We call for full implementation of the recommendations of the report and for ensuring accountability for the perpetrators. It is now up to the Ethiopian government to carry out its promises on this. In conclusion, I would like to express deep regret that 1 year after the start of the conflict, the situation in northern Ethiopia has only deteriorated, with expanded hostilities, mounting deaths, and suffering of civilians, and a catastrophic humanitarian situation. In order to preserve the stability, unity, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia, all sides must cease the hostilities and solve their differences through a genuine and inclusive national dialogue. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante de Estonia por su declaración y doy ahora la palabra a la representante de Estados Unidos.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me start by recognizing and thanking the Council for getting out the statement last Friday that called for a ceasefire and expressed our strong concerns about the situation in Ethiopia. Thank you, Undersecretary General DiCarlo, for your briefing. And thank you to African Union High Representative Obasanjo for your briefing, and very specifically for your on-the-ground reports and efforts in the region. We strongly urge all parties to support and cooperate with you as you work to bring peace and stability to the region. The conflict in Ethiopia has now been going on for a full year. And this is a tremendously sad milestone. And as my Irish colleague stated, we really remained silent for too long. Over the past year, we have seen constant violence. We've witnessed widespread human rights abuses and atrocities. We've seen credible, documented, and persistent reports from a wide range of sources of looting, displacement, extrajudicial executions, rape, and sexual violence as weapons of war. And we've seen the threat of mass famine loom large as humanitarian aid and medical supplies are delayed and denied from going to civilians who need it most. The Joint UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission report details all of this very clearly. It makes it plain that there have been many human rights violations and abuses. and it demonstrates that the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, the Eritrean Defense Forces, the Amhara Special Forces, and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front are all culpable. There are no good guys here. There are only victims on all sides. This vital report was limited in geography and chronology. Both should be expanded to ensure more recent allegations from across the region can be investigated and perpetrators held accountable. In the meantime, the violations and abuses documented cannot be tolerated. Suspected individuals need to be removed from active duty pending investigation. Independent bodies must be allowed to investigate and ensure accountability. Humanitarians must be allowed unimpeded access, and the violence must stop. This is not the Ethiopia that we thought we would see 2 years earlier, when we were applauding this country as the fastest growing economy in Africa. The unity and integrity of the Ethiopian state faces an existential threat from within, and millions of innocent civilians are at risk as the conflict expands and warring parties advance toward Addis. Mr. President, colleagues, it is time for all parties to immediately halt hostilities and refrain from incitement to violence and divisiveness. The bellicose rhetoric and inflammatory language on all sides of this conflict only aggravate into communal violence. It is time for the government of Ethiopia, the TPLF, and all other groups to engage in immediate ceasefire negotiations without preconditions to find a sustainable path toward peace. And it is long past time for the Eritrean Defense Forces to withdraw from Ethiopian territory. It is time to put your weapons down. And let me repeat that. It is time to put your weapons down. This war between angry, belligerent men victimizing women and children has to stop. As we call for peace, I want to address some critics who have said that the United States is biased toward one side of the conflict. Let me be crystal clear. We condemn violence on all sides. We condemn any and all human rights violations and abuses committed by all sides. So we condemn the violence by the ENDF and the Eritrean Defense Forces, and we condemn the TPLF's violence. We condemn the TPLF's expansion of war outside of Tigray. The TPLF must withdraw from Afar and Amhara. And we call on the TPLF and the Oromo Liberation Army to immediately stop the current advance toward Addis. We also call on the Ethiopian government to respect international humanitarian law. We're not taking sides. Innocent people, innocent Ethiopians are starving in northern Ethiopia. Withholding food and medical supplies is not acceptable. It is not an acceptable tactic at any time, and frankly, it's unconscionable and not what we would expect from Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government must allow UN agencies and their partners to staff their operations with the specialized expertise required to mount an effective response. The reckless expulsion of UN officials are an affront to the United Nations and to the people of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government must also investigate the terrible killings of humanitarian and human rights workers and hold those responsible to account. And it must cease all arbitrary detentions and ethnic targeting in Addis. Given the nationwide state of emergency, we are concerned about the safety of U.S. citizens, U.S. government personnel and their dependents, and the security of our facilities remain paramount. We will do everything in our power to keep our people safe, but we also ask that the state of emergency not be used as a pretense to attack civilians. We know, and you all know, the only solution to this conflict is a political solution. To that end, the African Union has an important role in resolving this conflict and sustaining regional peace and security. And I wish to thank President Obasanjo again for his efforts. Similarly, we support Kenyan President Kenyatta's November 3rd call for all parties to return to political negotiations, and also his efforts in this regard. Ultimately, the only ones who can bring lasting peace to Ethiopia are its leaders and its people. Only a wider dialogue about the future of their state, where all of Ethiopia's people are represented, can lead to broader democratic and economic renewal. It is never too late for peace, but the longer this conflict goes on, the harder the road to peace becomes, and the more people will die. And as you heard from High Representative Obasanjo, the window of opportunity is limited and time is running out. I urge all parties in the strongest possible terms to back away from the brink and lead their people toward peace, and to resume the development agenda that will lead to prosperity for all Ethiopians. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco a la representante de Estados Unidos por su declaración y doy ahora la palabra a la representante de la Federación de Rusia.
Господин председатель, внимательно выслушали информацию высокого представителя председателя Африканского союза по региону Африканского рога Олусегуна Обасанджо, а также заместителя генсекретаря ООН по политическим вопросам и миростроительству Розмари Ди Карло о последнем развитии ситуации на севере Эфиопии. Приветствуем участие в сегодняшнем заседании постоянного представителя страны при ООН. Российская Федерация с тревогой следит за развитием обстановки в эфиопских регионах Тиграй, Афар и Амхара, где происходят столкновения правительственных сил с подразделениями сил обороны Тиграя, а также присоединившихся к ним других группировок, в том числе из армии освобождения Орома. Бои вокруг городов Десса и Камболчи на прошлой неделе убедительно показали, что продолжение насилия ведет к новым жертвам и тяжелым гуманитарным последствиям для мирных граждан. Особое беспокойство внушает продолжающая деградировать гуманитарная ситуация в затронутых боевыми действиями районах. В Дессе и Камболче, на территории которых и до конфликта проживало значительное число беженцев и ВПЛ, столкновения привели к стремительному росту числа беженцев и внутренне перемещенных лиц. Из-за непрекращающихся нападений инфот общее число гражданских лиц, нуждающихся в гумсодействии, уже достигло 7 миллионов человек. Гуманитарная помощь всем регионам страны должна быть увеличена. По-прежнему исходим из того, что она должна оказываться в тесной координации с суверенным правительством и в строгом соответствии с базовыми руководящими принципами ООН. Господин председатель, как мы говорили и ранее, противоречия в Эфиопии весьма глубоки и имеют сложный исторический контекст. Более того, происходящее в стране обладает высоким негативным потенциалом для всего региона. В этой связи на протяжении всех этих месяцев мы призывали к тому, чтобы игроки, имеющие влияние на ситуацию, а также средства массовой информации, занимали ответственную позицию, не повышали градус международной риторики и не подливали масло в огонь и так зашкаливающей межнациональной розни. Уверены также в том, что введение незаконных односторонних санкций, угроза их применения и отказ в предоставлении экономического содействия весьма контрпродуктивны и приведут только к ухудшению положения и так страдающих простых людей, а отнюдь не примирению. Нет никакого иного пути урегулирования, кроме как поддержать национальные и региональные усилия по достижению прекращения внутриэфиопского силового противостояния и налаживанию диалога с целью восстановления мира и поэтапной социально-экономической стабилизации во всей Эфиопии. На различных исторических этапах эфиопы неоднократно доказывали свою способность жить в межнациональном согласии и строить общую государственность. Это подтвердили проведенные в этом году в мирной и демократической обстановке всеобщие выборы. Высокий уровень поддержки правительству страны показали также прошедшие на днях массовые демонстрации в Аддис-Абебе. Господин председатель, знаем о предпринимающихся в последнее время различных посреднических усилиях по линии ООН и Афросоюза. К сожалению, как показывает ситуация на Земле, они не дали пока существенных результатов. В этой связи рассчитываем, господин Обасанджо, что вы, как честный и беспристрастный брокер, предпримете необходимые срочные шаги к тому, чтобы переломить ситуацию к миру. Все необходимые сигналы Советом Безопасности были направлены в принятом 5 ноября заявлении для прессы. Приветствуем также проводимую в регионе работу главой управления ООН по координации гуманитарных вопросов Мартином Гриффитсом. Надеемся, что эти усилия придадут импульс работе гуманитарщиков на Земле, в том числе в плане налаживания бесперебойной гуманитарной помощи. В заключение хотели бы подтвердить нашу приверженность сохранению единства и территориальной целостности дружественной нам Эфиопии. Убеждены в том, что это безальтернативная основа для разрешения всех спорных вопросов. Я благодарю за внимание.
Agradezco a la representante de la Federación de Rusia por su declaración. Formularé ahora una declaración en mi carácter de representante de México. Agradezco, por supuesto, a la secretaria general adjunta, Rosemary DiCarlo, y al presidente Obasanjo por sus muy informativas intervenciones. Hemos convocado a esta reunión ante nuestra profunda preocupación por la situación en Etiopía. El avance del Frente Popular de Liberación de Tigray, la movilización del Ejército de Liberación Oromo y los continuos ataques aéreos del ejército etíope contra Mekele constituyen una intensificación exponencial de las hostilidades cuyos efectos se expanden ahora también hacia las regiones de Amhara y Afar. La reciente decisión del gobierno etíope de declarar el estado de emergencia es una señal clara de que si las partes persisten en la opción militar, el conflicto se generalizará a todo el país y tendrá graves consecuencias no solo para la población etíope, que ya las padece, sino también para toda la región. Por ello, respaldamos y alentamos los esfuerzos regionales para encontrar una solución negociada a la crisis, en particular los desplegados por el enviado especial de la Unión Africana para el Cuerno de África, el presidente Obasanjo. En el ámbito humanitario, vemos con inquietud que los ataques aéreos contra Mekele, como decía, obligaron ya a la ONU a suspender sus vuelos hacia dicha ciudad, con lo que la entrada de dinero en efectivo y del personal humanitario a la zona se ha visto interrumpida, agravando entonces las condiciones de vida de la población civil. Nos preocupa que a pesar de la existencia de alimentos y productos de primera necesidad para la población en Tigray, estos no se pueden entregar debido a la falta de combustible y dinero para pagar a los contratistas. Es necesario que el gobierno etíope dé garantías de seguridad para que se reanuden por lo menos los 2 vuelos semanales hacia Mekele que operaban hasta hace unas semanas. Todas las partes deben respetar sus obligaciones conforme al derecho internacional humanitario. Es vital que se permita el acceso irrestricto de la ayuda humanitaria sin mayor dilación. Además, México toma nota del informe de la investigación conjunta que realizaron la Comisión Etíope de Derechos Humanos y la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada para los Derechos Humanos, el cual da cuenta de agresiones contra la población civil, tales como ejecuciones extrajudiciales, tortura y desapariciones forzadas, violencia sexual y de género, desplazamiento forzoso de civiles, negación de acceso a la ayuda humanitaria, arresto e intimidación de periodistas, entre otros. estas violaciones al derecho internacional de los derechos humanos y al derecho internacional humanitario por parte de todos los actores en el conflicto deben ser investigadas y sancionadas. En este contexto, mi delegación reitera el llamado de este Consejo a todas las partes a un cese el fuego y que se establezcan las condiciones para un diálogo nacional. México exhorta a que se inicien negociaciones de inmediata y sin ninguna clase de precondición. México deplora que pese a los indicios del potencial destructivo de este conflicto y de los llamados reiterados de las agencias de las Naciones Unidas sobre la gravedad de la situación humanitaria, el Consejo de Seguridad no haya sido capaz de evitar esta escalada del conflicto. Vemos con gran preocupación el uso de una retórica belicista que agita la animosidad entre grupos étnicos. Sabemos hasta dónde puede llevar la instrumentación del discurso de odio en un país tan diverso, pero confiamos en que este Consejo de Seguridad habrá aprendido de los errores pasados y sabrá esta vez asumir su responsabilidad para facilitar un proceso político que conduzca a la paz en Etiopía. Vuelvo a asumir ahora la función de presidente del Consejo y doy ahora la palabra al representante de Etiopía. Tiene usted la palabra.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor and for allowing the participation of my country in this briefing. I also congratulate you on Mexico's presidencies of the Council for the month of November. I recognize the presence of His Excellency President Obasanjo, High Representative of the African Union to the Horn of Africa, and Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo. I thank both for their briefing. Mr. President, a year ago, the Northern Command of the Ethiopian National Defense Force was attacked within. The unsuspecting men and women in uniform were slain in the dark hours of November 4, 2020. The long-standing service and sacrifice of the National Defense Forces is rewarded by unprecedented level of betrayal and treasonous attack waged by TPLF. Ethiopia will never forget the patriots and their service and sacrifice. The day will also go down as a day of infamy in Ethiopia's proud history. In this connection, I would like to extend our thanks to members of this council who stood with my country during this very trying year. Mr. President, in the past year, we reversed the military threat posed by TPLF. In parallel, we made all efforts to provide food and non-food items to people in need in Tigray. We signed a humanitarian assistance agreement with the United Nations. We spent close to 100 million birr for assistance and reconstruction. We declared humanitarian ceasefire and withdraw our forces, and we implored the treasonous group to hand over leaders of its criminal scheme and leave its rank and file members to live in peace. All this is proven to be in vain. It didn't help us gain peace. Today, I will not provide you details on the humanitarian assistance we delivered to our people in need. As a result of the continued and now widespread criminal belligerence of TPLF, the people of Tigray that needed urgent humanitarian assistance are not having any aid delivered. The people in Afar and Amara regions are rendered vulnerable. Cities and towns are shelled. Residents are killed in their doorsteps and robbed their earnings from their toil. True to its unscrupulous and cruel nature, TPLF is causing terror and mayhem. As we speak, Ethiopians in the northern part of the country are fending for their life and the life of their children. The trucks we sent to Tigray with food and medical supplies are transporting weapons and use, combatants that are frauded or forced to fight against their brothers and sisters for no apparent public interest, but for the greedy-driven political agenda of a few individuals. Excellencies, we honor and respect the call for political dialogue. It is an approach we fully prescribe to and even applied in resolving many intrastate and interstate disputes. Inherently, our current situation is not any different. There is a deep-seated political difference and grievances in our nascent democracy. We are also a diverse nation and a home to 83 languages and many groups than headlines care to mention with unaddressed legitimate quests and demands. However, no political group, despite their grievances, have raised an arm against their brethren. No ethnic or political group, despite its unfulfilled demands, have waged war against the motherland. Diversity is not Ethiopia's problem. Our challenge is not, as some reluctantly posit, a failure to manage diversity. Diversity is Ethiopia's asset. Our problem is a criminal group that refused to accept equality and let go ill-gained supremacy and privilege. Unfortunately, this group garners support from many sources. Some media outlets in the West, some staff members and leaders of international organizations openly support the group. For your surprise, we sometimes learn the motives and the next steps of the group from statements and speeches of high-placed officials of these entities. As you may recall, even this council was made to convene over a false report alleging heinous crimes, including the use of anger as a weapon of war. Thankfully, truth has come out, and these malicious accusations are dispelled by a joint investigation report of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Our plea for members of the international community, states and non-state actors, to refrain from providing moral and material support went unheeded. TPLF is emboldened and numbed itself to an extent it stopped counting the lives of Ethiopians from Tigray, its sacrifice on its hopeless journey. It is emboldened to a level it threatens to unseat a popularly elected federal government and destabilize a nation of 112 million people. We again reiterate our plea for the support of this group that have been providing it with communication equipment, satellite information, weapons, and even fighters to desist from this. It is not only illegal, but also an immoral act. Mr. President, Ethiopia is pained. What we have gone through at the hands of this criminal group will require intergenerational effort to heal. For this, Ethiopia needs its children to dialogue and reconcile. We have time and again expressed our readiness and explained the preparation for national political dialogue. Had it not been for the bloodshed caused by the TPLF, even the political future of this group would have had a prospect of resolution through dialogue. In line with our commitment, we entertained the efforts for support and undertook the work with all our friends to learn from their experience and draw the available and relevant lesson and support. We accepted the High Representative of the African Union to the Horn of Africa and assist his role. We believe the regional solution is best placed to support us get out of this problem. This being said, our route to a dialogue and political solution will not be straightforward or easy. For now, we are focused on halting the TPLF and rescuing and reaching our public that suffered immensely under its cruel and deceptive methods. In this regard, we remind everyone concerned there are no two parties here. There is a government representing the whole of the Ethiopian people and representing the Ethiopian state, and there is a group advancing its criminal cause through atrocities. any attempt, including the media campaign we have been witnessing in the past few days, to launder the TPLF and diminish the horror it committed against the Ethiopian people will only be counterproductive. Mr. President, what exalts my country as a nation is to overcome its own challenges. What may raise us as a country is the commitment of all Ethiopians to bring peace and stability. What is needed is well-meant insight and forethought and support. Statements of marginalization, sanctions, punitive measures will not help, or rather counterproductive. Out of our conviction to peaceful solution to all disputes, we will keep engaging all well-meaning actors, the AU High Representative, and regional leaders. In the course of this process, we hope we have the understanding of this Council and its membership. I would like to assure the Council member that my country will prevail as it did in the past in the face of all its adversities. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante de Etiopía por su declaración. Quiero preguntar ahora a nuestros presentadores iniciales si tienen algún comentario adicional que formular al Consejo. No tengo ya ningún otro orador inscrito en mi lista. De no ser el caso, quiero entonces invitar ahora a los miembros del Consejo a celebrar consultas oficiosas para proseguir el examen del tema. Se levanta la sesión.